Так, качество соединения отличное. Мгм. Так, управление видео. Так, действие. Изменить. Нет, 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 не то. Так, сведения. Так. Мгм. Открытый доступ. Доступ по ссылке. Окей. Сохранить. Изменения сохранены. Хорошо. Остается только по новой отправить ссылку. Мгм. Так, хорошо. Трансляцию обновили. Битрейт. Оу. Камеру чуть ниже поставь. Да, можно. Угу. Одну минуту. Так, готово. Теперь ничего лишнего. Что же, пожалуй, начнем остальную трансляцию. Раз времени на разговоры с аудиторией не хватило, да и самой аудитории как таковой немного, то приступим к сути самой трансляции. То бишь, представлю некоторые из видео разработчика и под конец обсудим их. Ай, господи. Откуда эти потери кадров? Откуда? Угу. Да, скорее всего, слишком высокий битрейт. А его тогда придется опять обновлять. Угу. 3 человека. Аж любопытно стало, кто зашел. Так, ладно. Как и обещал. Начнем с просмотра видео, и под конец будем их обсуждать. А затем, как настанет 22 час, скорее не когда настанет 22 час, а несколько до этого, сделаем чаек. Угу. Так, звук подался. Так, на чем остановился? Да. И как чаек приготовим, посмотрим последнюю серию журнала разработки. Что же, камеру выключаю. Звук тоже. И начинаем просмотр. Мгм.
Okay, 6 new devlogs about a new update. I am psyched. Guess what it is about if I play you some music.
Those of you that have been following this game for a while must have noticed that the scope is growing.
This is no longer a small game about simple ecosystems. This is a game about life in space, borrowing heavily from sci-fi movies and games. But if you think about aliens in games and movies, there's one thing you might think about that the Sapling does not have. Horror.
One of the main pillars of the next big update will therefore be body parts and game mechanics that are scary. Interestingly, the most requested scary thing you will see if we create a planet with an animal and a plant with flowers, turn on random mutations, and then create an area here without any nutrients. Which is a new soil statistic, more details later. Okay, let's run this for a few minutes while I tell you about other things that will be in this update and return later. For those of you new here, this is evolution simulation game The Sapling, my solo indie game project. It has two game modes. There are scenarios tasking you to design an ecosystem that meets specific requirements, but there's also a sandbox where you can build your own algae, plants and animals, turn on random mutations and see how they evolve.
Okay, so an update with scary stuff. But what is fear or emotion in general? To be honest, I don't really know, but I can tell you what it is in the simulation.
From now on, in the behavior UI, there will be a new hormone tab, where you can define up to 5 hormones. You can think of hormones as extra status bars, like the health bar, that can go up and down depending on what happens to the animal. And just like you're completely free to design whatever season you want to see, allowing you to create something very different from what we have anywhere on Earth, you also have complete freedom for the hormones. You decide the starting level when an animal is born, how it changes every day, what events increase and decrease the hormone level, and how the animal responds to it. And to give it a true alien flavor, I've even had some fun with a quick hormone name generator. So let's say this hormone represents fear. When the animal is born, it starts at 0 and it slowly fades away over time. So what will trigger this hormone? I've added quite a number of new triggers, like being pregnant or low health, but let's say that if you see other members of your species, you feel safe, so that will make it go down. But if you see an animal that is red and striped, the hormone will go up drastically. Existing players will notice that there are now a lot more patterns to choose from. I've made it way easier for myself to add new skin patterns, so I immediately couldn't stop myself from doubling the amount. But more importantly, the skin patterns, one of the few things about animals that were purely decorative, now also have meaning, because they can be used for danger recognition. If, for example, a lot of animals are afraid of striped predators, having a striped skin becomes an evolutionary advantage. To be able to test whatever hormone system you come up with, I have now also redesigned the UI that pops up whenever you zoom in on an animal. And furthermore, there is now also a light attached to your cursor, so if you want to be able to trigger a particular action manually, you can create an instinct that says, if you see a light, do something.
The cool part of this system, at least if you ask me, is that you can use it for all kinds of behavior. For example, you can also use the hormones as a counter to only do a particular action if something happens multiple times. Or maybe a timer, so that the animal will do something at a certain stage in life. Or a combination of the two, so that it only responds if something happens multiple times within a short time frame.
But of course a hormone isn't useful if the animals don't respond to it. Besides the actions already in the game, like crying, glowing or running away, I'm adding several new ones. In the context of this scary update, the most important one of these is to hide in your shell. This new action will become available if you select one of 3 new skin types inspired by turtle shells. When I started working on this update, this idea was actually quite low on the list of ideas, because I expected it would require a complex procedural system to build around the shape of the body. But the first experiments showed this wasn't the case at all. It looks totally fine, even if the shell always stays the same. The only slightly more intelligent thing is that it tries to figure out where the neck ends and the torso begins. When there are side limbs, it will use the first side leg for this, otherwise it will take a position somewhere in the middle. Furthermore, the first 2 segments are used to calculate the rotation of the shell. Besides this streamlined shell for swimming creatures, there's also this one for land creatures. It's better at temperature regulation and is inspired by tortoises. And finally, this shell might seem inspired by speculative evolution, but is actually the alligator snapping turtle. But it's not just skin types, there will also be body parts to unlock the hide action. It took me a while to get used to the idea of non-slimy creatures to be able to hide in a shell like this, but then I remembered the hermit crab. To model these shells, I've used Blender's geometry nodes for the first time, and man, this stuff is gold. Look, I've got here all of these simple machines basically that I've linked together, so they form what is basically a procedural shell generator. And I've got all of these knobs that I can turn to change it however I want. Speaking of body parts, there will again be lots of new body parts in this update. I mentioned before that I have improved my DevTools to import them, and these DevTools are now integrated into the game. This not only makes it easier for modders to add their own custom body parts, it also makes the process even more efficient for me. And boy did I use them.
The final number might be slightly different, but last time I counted we were going from 190 body parts in the build that's currently live to 272 body parts. That's of course way more than I can introduce in these 6 devlogs, so along with the body parts in the main story, I will show 2 new bonus body parts at the end of every video and tell a little bit about them. So even if I bore you out of your mind talking about theoretical biology or optimizing code, which I will talk about in a later episode by the way, you have something to look forward to.
To keep all of these new body parts apart, I'm also going to officially name them, which is actually a surprisingly common request. Naming body parts is something I never seriously considered when starting, but back then I only had 5 or 6 shapes per body part type instead of 50 or so. To come up with the names, I'm taking a lot of inspiration from the player-maintained wiki. I'll put a link in the description below, but I sometimes go for a somewhat longer name with more words. This is because, besides naming, I have the additional goal of explaining what you can do with this body part. So we've seen hiding with a skin type, hiding with a body part, and now the final one, hiding with your color. Oh, sorry. One of the new statistics visible in the new organism detail UI is the camouflage level. This level will get higher if the skin color is closer to the color of the grass in that area. Or if there's no grass, it will use the color of the ground instead. So prey animals in a world with yellow grass are more likely to evolve yellow fur, and animals on a snow planet are more likely to become white. When designing this feature, I tried to incorporate more realism for a long time. To explain what I mean by that, have a look at this, which is how animals hunted by tigers see the world. And this is how humans see the world. In other words, your color vision really determines what is camouflage to you. In the Sapling, different eyes can make distinctions in different color ranges. I've even added a new visualization to make this clearer, so it feels like something should be done with that. But here's the problem, I expect at least part of the player base won't know that tiger fact, so wouldn't understand what's going on. Imagine you see a bright purple animal that really sticks out in the environment. How do I communicate to the player that this one is camouflaged to some of the prey animals in this ecosystem?
So at least for now, to keep things simple, we have just one camouflage system, that is, camouflage as perceived by humans.
Okay, enough defense, let's go to why all the creatures I've been teasing look so scary. Attack. I've added quite a few new body parts that add extra attack, and a large part of these are underwater mouths, which is good because the game has fewer options there. But it's not just attack. In the previous update I've added a poisoned state for animals, mainly intended as a way for plants to select which animals eat their fruit. As you can imagine, the step from poison to venom is incredibly small. Animals now have a venom type, and if you give them a venomous mouth, or other venomous body part, they can poison other animals around them. When I say poisonous body parts, I mostly mean abdomens with poisonous stingers, like this one. Previously I had only one, intended for storing liquid, that didn't connect to any other body part. The result was that animals could evolve these huge body parts basically out of nothing, which was kinda weird. It also happened during the latest evolution simulated run, and I decided to keep them out of the frame because it was so strange. Now instead there's a whole family tree of related abdomens, which is way more gradual and just better. And then finally, as the last scary thing in this video, animals won't be the only organisms to catch prey anymore. Let's have a look at our little patch of land without nutrients. As you can see, plants are growing here again, but where are they getting their nutrients? You guessed it, they catch them. To save myself some time, there are no animal catching animations or something like that, because obviously I never set up a complicated animation system for plants. I might add it later, no promises, but for now animals just disappear when they are eaten. You can tell it happened though, because the predator plants show up in the species detail view. And with that often requested scary thing, we will end this episode. But with 5 more episodes to come, you might wonder, what other scary things can you add to this game besides body parts for animals and even plants? Well, you will see. And now for the bonus body parts I promised. Our first bonus body part is inspired by rattlesnakes, and it's the first body part outside of the mouth that can make noise. In real life, rattlesnakes use their rattle to warn off predators, but in the Sapling you can of course set the instincts however you want. The second is a mouth with a ballistic tongue, which evolved independently in both salamanders and frogs. We already saw last time how the trunk mouth has its own eating animation, and this is essentially the same thing. It was super annoying when looking for reference, because the frog mouth is also a bird. Okay, bye.
Итак, мы посмотрели. Теперь настало время обсуждения. Меня система, связанная с гормонами, весьма увлекла. Хотя бы потому, что теперь мы сможем программировать различных создаваемых нами в игре животных куда более сложным образом. И вместе с тем меня увлекла одна вещь, связанная с камуфляжем, что поначалу разработчик пытался внедрить несколько больший реализм, связанный со зрением существа и того окрасом, и окрасом животного хищника, что жертва уловить может или не может. И что разработчик решил отменить для некоторой простоты. Для меня весьма занятное решение. Быть может, даже практичное. Что же думаете вы? Угу. Ладно. Никто не смотрит. Тогда продолжим просмотр остальных видео. И следующее будет симуляция экосистем в темноте. Смотрим.
Darkness.
И почему не грузится? А нет, грузится.
Darkness. It's something all life in the universe will need to deal with somehow. Except during a polar summer or if you're on a planet that's tightly locked, but you get the point. But of course, all animals live in darkness, in the night.
Indeed, some pretty cool
In the night.
Indeed, some pretty cool stuff has evolved here on Earth, like a distinction between day and night animals, night vision, so this update is the perfect opportunity to do something with that in a simulation.
For those of you new here, this is Evolution simulation game The Sapling, my solo indie game project. It has two game modes. There are scenarios tasking you to design an ecosystem that meets specific requirements, but there's also a sandbox where you can build your own algae, plants and animals, turn on random mutations and see how they evolve. So to start, you will now be able to change the length of a day in the planet editor. Besides the slider here, I also changed the rotation speed to visualize this. Whatever day length you pick though, the day-night cycle will be much shorter than it used to be, because before even very large animals with long lifespans didn't live through more than a night or two. I was unhappy about this initially because I've grown attached to the way the days slowly fade into the night and vice versa, but it does have the advantage that speeding up time now shows you lots of days and nights in quick succession, which clearly communicates to the player that time is going really fast. On top of day duration, within the cycle you can now modify the duration of night, dawn, day and dusk. This means you can have a map with very long evenings, for example, or a map where it is always dark. And I'll say it before you say it, this is of course a huge simplification of how it really works. In reality, it's always dark on one side of the map and light at the other, and the duration of the night depends on how close you are to the poles. But hey, building a good simulation is recognizing what are good opportunities to simplify, and I think this is one. Related to this, now the day-night cycle will actually have meaning in the simulation, the mixed timescales problem will be even more noticeable. Fortunately, I'm in good company here because many simulation games have this problem. In Roller Coaster Tycoon, for example, you can build a whole attraction in a few days, which seems too short, but individual guests stay in the park for months or even years, which is of course way too long.
In the Sapling, each simulation tick is called a year, and that's both too short if you look at how fast life is evolving, and too long, because even with a shortened day-night cycle, a single cycle can take a century or so. Anyway, not a single player has complained about this so far, so it's probably fine. I guess to players of this game, the only thing that matters is how does it affect life. The first thing I want to achieve is that leaves evolve to be huge on darker planets. This is inspired by how the leaves in tropical rainforests, often living in the shadows of other plants, can be very large as well.
To make sure leaves interact with night and days at all, they now have separate sunlight collection statistics for each of the 3 periods. What we had before is now the amount of sunlight collected during daytime, and if you click these buttons in the corner, you will see how much sunlight these leaves collect during twilight and the night. But if I stopped here, what would happen in practice is that the darker planets would just always have the larger leaf types, which collect the most energy. I need a more ambitious solution, which is resizing leaves with a middle mouse button. From now on, a leaf like this one will catch an above average amount of sunlight when small, but will catch a huge amount when scaled up, but at the cost of wind and temperature resistance. This one, at the other hand, doesn't lose that much of its wind resistance when it's larger, but its increase in sunlight collection is also less extreme. As a side note, for this one I also redid the model, as my modeling standards have increased over the years and this one didn't make the cut anymore.
Anyway, when I had this system figured out and translated into code, I was pretty happy with myself for some time. But then I started experimenting and it turned out it didn't work at all like intended.
What I had forgotten is that this system, where the requirements become more strict when you make the leaf larger, also worked the other way around. If you make any leaf tiny, it will basically grow everywhere. In other words, if I stop here, on planets with long nights, plants will evolve lots and lots of tiny leaves, which is the exact opposite of what I want. The solution I've chosen in the end can be seen in these 2 new leaf shapes. Let me explain. The soil statistic shallow groundwater has been in the game since the very beginning. It was the first one I implemented, but what it really means has shifted over time. Ever since I've chosen to visualize this statistic not only by darker soil but also by rain clouds, it has actually come to mean moisture. So the first step is to rename it everywhere in the game. What we need to solve the problem with leaf scaling is some sort of requirement that depends on leaf shape alone and is not influenced by scale. And moisture resistance is the perfect candidate for this. For example, plants in very wet areas typically evolve a drip tip to quickly shed water, so this leaf, and for example also this one, can handle high moisture areas. Plants in very dry areas, on the other hand, are typically very fleshy to retain water, like these 2.
Okay, that's what I had to say about plants. Let's move on to animals. A large part of the animal kingdom has specialized either for the day or the night. I want that too.
In the game so far, all animals were active all the time, so the first step is a rest bar that needs to be filled up every now and then by sleeping. This mechanic by itself will not lead to specialization, because animals can sleep whenever they want. So let's give them a reason to prefer the day over the night or vice versa, by also splitting up the statistic that describes how far eyes can look into the distance. Some eyes, like these ones, will be able to look far into the distance at daytime, but will barely see anything at nighttime, while others might not be able to see exceptionally well at daytime, but this also doesn't really change at night.
At this point I can hear the expert players say, yeah, that won't really work, because in the sapling vision isn't that important. In areas where you have a lot of food, animals can just walk around and accidentally bump into everything they need to reproduce.
So let's change that. From now on, for all food types except plankton, animals will need at least one dot in the see at distance statistic to be able to eat, otherwise it will not find the food even if standing directly next to it. This means some animals won't be able to find food at night and thus will prefer to do their resting during that time, which creates an interesting gap for animals that do see at night, which will prefer sleeping during daytime.
Okay, cool, so that's behavior in the dark. But how would a darker planet affect the appearance of animals? There's two things I can think of.
Firstly, I think really bright colors wouldn't make any sense in the dark, so I want to make sure color vision will be turned off at night for all eyes. Also, if you have a diet to only eat red fruits or something like that, that will no longer work at night. The other thing I would expect is for animals to have huge eyes. And well, we have resizing for leaves, why not do the same thing for eyes? Just like with leaves, scaling up increases one statistic, in this case how far an animal can look into the distance at night, while it decreases another, in this case how far an animal can see during the day. The implementation shares a lot of code with leaves, so it's convenient to add, except for one weird quirk in playtesters' expectations that I discovered. Playtesters expect leaves to scale from wherever they are attached to the plant, but most eyes to scale from the center. Except for eyes on stalks, which should apparently behave like leaves. To be able to make the scaling mechanic feel intuitive for all body parts, I've now made it so that I can define a scaling anchor point for each individual shape. But if we're talking about darkness, there's one place that is always dark: the deep ocean. Starting with algal blooms, the more expert players had basically two complaints. Firstly, many people noted that the filter feeders were never really successful because they do not have to stop moving to eat. This means filter feeders can eat really quickly, too quickly, because they nearly always exhaust their own food supply. Secondly, it was kinda weird that holdfast algae and floating microalgae shared one slot in the simulation. This meant that floating algae could not spread to places that already had holdfast algae. So let's split them. It was a lot of plumbing behind the scenes because I never expected this split when implementing algae, but theoretically there wasn't a good reason not to solve both problems this way. So now the blocking only works in one direction. Holdfast algae can no longer occupy a slot for floating microalgae, but the microalgae can block the sun and thus make the spot too dark for holdfast algae. But I've also added another slot, the deep sea. When you move the camera down, the fog and the background get darker and darker to make visually clear to the player that almost no light penetrates here, and the eyes will need good night vision to see anything. But perhaps more importantly, this deep down I'm also adding an extra particle system. It's nearly identical to the bubbles, except that the translucent spheres have been replaced by white specks, and it moves down instead of upwards. Marine snow. This deep into the ocean, no algae will survive, so just like in real life, deep sea animals will filter feed on a continuous shower of that organic material falling from the upper layers of the water. I have to admit there's still a lot of balancing to be done here, so please don't expect this to work right out of the box, but let's say that this is the foundation for deep sea ecosystems. Kinda wild to think that we went from leaves adapted for dry environments via sleep and resizable eyes to a new deep sea slot, all for one reason: to be able to play the sapling in the dark. Okay then, for today's bonus body parts I've got these alien looking spherical leaves inspired by the string of pearls plant. Its strange shape is for storing water and minimizing surface area for dry environments. It only has a tiny window to let some light in for photosynthesis. Furthermore, I've got these eyes inspired by the mantis shrimp. They not only look cool, but mantis shrimp can perceive wavelengths of light ranging from deep ultraviolet to far red. Okay, bye.
Что могу сказать насчет этого видео? А почему все белое? Теперь не белое. Здесь предложены весьма любопытные механики, но пока что не нахожу чего-либо, что мог бы о них рассказать или что-нибудь о них обсудить. Потому продолжим просмотр. Третьим видео. Добавление пола в мою видеоигру. Смотрим.
I am adding sexual reproduction to the simulation, and it is like putting a multiplier on all cool phenomena. And if that's the case, you might wonder, you've been working on this game for years now, what took you so long? Well, because it's also an opportunity to do something much bigger, because it doesn't necessarily stop at two sexes that remain the same throughout an animal's lifetime. In this video we will go over all stages and possible side paths, from asexual reproduction via animals with a larval stage, all the way to species with a separate worker and queen form. This is the scary and sexy update.
For those of you new here, this is Evolution simulation game The Sapling, my solo indie game project. It has two game modes. There are scenarios tasking you to design an ecosystem that meets specific requirements, but there's also a sandbox where you can build your own algae, plants and animals, turn on random mutations and see how they evolve.
First of all, why is sexual reproduction even so common on Earth? Also, humans cannot reproduce without first exchanging genes. How can that be advantageous over just reproducing whenever you feel like it?
Let's say we have a population of 100 animals that will give birth to a new generation next year, also of 100 animals, which will, the year after that, also produce 100 animals, etc. Which animals get to reproduce and how often is mostly decided at random, but it's also influenced by one trait, let's call it fitness. Fitness is a number between 0 and 100, and the closer to 100 it is, the more likely that an animal will be a parent to at least one of the children of the next generation. The average fitness number in the population, you guessed it, varies at random, but because animals with higher fitness are more likely to reproduce, it increases over time, like this. There's a large random component to this simulation, so it's different every time you run it. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it takes a little while and then catches up, sometimes it even goes down at the end. The only thing we can say for sure is that it goes up most of the time. Now imagine that each animal is not the child of one parent but a mix of two. How does that change the fitness over time? In this run it goes up quickly and stays high. Let's do another one, and another one, and another one. As you can see, sexual reproduction is a much more reliable way to spread beneficial adaptations within a species. With asexual reproduction, the same thing might happen, but it also might not happen, you don't know. While with sexual reproduction, it always goes up and it's always fast. If you want to try this for yourself, I've published a Python script I've used for this on GitHub. The link is in the description below. Okay, so that's the theory, but how do we add this to the game? Well, what you maybe didn't realize is that sexual reproduction already is in the game, but only for plants. The system there allows only plants with the same pollination organ, for example flowers, to fertilize each other. The result is a blend of these two plants, and it works with any plant, no matter how different. I like the unique new plants that this generates, but it's not only unrealistic, it's also hard to extend to animals. I mean, how would it work? Would two animals need the same genitals to be able to mate? As a side note, after thinking about this long and hard, I've decided I'm not going to include genitals as a body part class. I do realize there's a significant group of more serious players that would do interesting experiments with that feature. But we all know what will happen if I add a penis body part to a game where everybody can place as many body parts wherever they want. Apparently the Spore developers even coined TTP as a technical term for this phenomenon, meaning time to penis. And let me tell you, the TTP for this game would be so short that it wouldn't be good for its reputation. Okay, so no genitals to decide who can mate with whom? Just mate with your own species then, as a more realistic solution. No, that wouldn't work either, because within a species there's barely any variation.
This is because in the Sapling, every organism with different body parts is classified as a separate species to match playtester expectations. In the end, I've settled on something in between. If we draw a family tree of species, organisms from this species can mate with the parent species and the grandparent species, but also with all species that branched off from it and the species that branched off from them. This way, if a species emerges that is somehow better adapted to survive somewhere, it will be able to mate with related species and spread its genes quickly. Next problem. How will the mating system itself work? For a long time I had all kinds of ideas floating around, like species that could reproduce both asexually and sexually, species that could fertilize each other's eggs, and after countless hours trying to design something simple and elegant, I suddenly had the insight that everything I wanted
could be summarized into 4 toggles that can all be turned on and off individually. Asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction, external fertilization and internal fertilization. The default so far was just asexual reproduction, but you can now also turn on sexual reproduction. And if you want to force mating, like in mammals, you can even turn off asexual reproduction. In a hermaphrodite species like this one, that does mean you should turn on internal fertilization. The other option, of course, is external fertilization, meaning that the animal first lays the eggs and that they are fertilized later by another individual. This won't be possible for eggs with a thicker shell though. To give the player some more options there, I've also added quite a few more egg types. An example of a land egg that can be fertilized looks like this. And since this is an update about horror, I've also added the ultimate scary alien egg from the movie Alien. Besides the fact that this one can be fertilized, you'll notice that it is firmly attached to the ground. This prevents it from being blown away in areas with high wind strength. In other words, wind resistance is another new statistic of eggs. An example of an egg that cannot handle high wind strength is this one, because it will simply roll away. If you need an egg that will actually stay in its nest, in return for less cold resistance, we now also have this one, inspired by dinosaur eggs. Aquatic eggs will use the underwater equivalent of wind strength, which is of course current speed. An example of an egg that can handle higher current speeds is this one, with hooks to attach to rocks and algae. It's inspired by the eggs of skates and sharks.
Okay, so we've discussed all options animals have when it comes to reproducing and sharing genes. But I totally didn't mention that other innovation that often goes together with sexual reproduction. You see, with the system I have described so far, mating does not happen that often, because it requires 2 animals meet that are sexually mature, not already pregnant, and have collected enough energy to give birth. It would be much more efficient if part of the population was always ready to mate and can focus on spreading genes. In other words, we need an evolutionary innovation called males.
But you might have noticed a pattern in my game design choices by now. It will be up to the player to create up to 6 sexes and define what each sex is. As an example, let's make the system how it works in humans. Sex A can do sexual reproduction and sex B does not give birth, but can spread genes internally. You also get to decide how likely each sex is for newborn animals by changing the letters on each of these eggs. And if you have more than one sex that can give birth, you can even change this for each sex individually. Or alternatively, you can make it so it depends on temperature, just like in turtles and crocodilians. Or perhaps you want to have it more dynamic and have animals change sex when needed. You could, for example, have a hormone that slowly fills up during an animal's lifetime and changes sex when it is full, but resets the hormone each time the animal sees a potential mate. With all of these options, players quickly lose track on what sex an animal is, so there will be two ways to keep sexes apart. The first one is simple. I'm now showing this information on mouse over, along with the species name. Playtesting shows that the first thing players really want to know is what an animal eats, so I've added the food icons as well. But of course, a much cooler way to keep sexes apart is by introducing sexual dimorphism. You can give different sexes different mating behavior, as we've just shown, but there's nothing stopping you from giving sexes other colors, other sizes, other body parts, anything really, as long as you keep the basic torso the same. Under the hood this was quite a pain to get right. I initially just wanted to take the easy approach and store a separate set of genes, so to say, for each sex. So in a species with 3 sexes, even though an individual is sex B, for example, it also carries all the info needed for sex A and sex C, which can in theory be completely different animals. This doesn't work, however, because it means each evolutionary innovation has to be discovered by each sex individually. So if sex A evolves a better mouth, this would only be useful to sex A and would not affect the other sexes in any way. So now instead, the first sex is used as the basis, and each additional sex is stored as a list of changes. And while this was already quite a pain to implement, the real headache started when I realized the new system would need to interact with every single little caching mechanism in the game. As you can imagine, the Sapling has optimization mechanisms all over the place to prevent frame rates in the single digits. To give you the simplest example, each time the game has to translate the genetic code for an organism into a 3D model, it stores the model in a cache, so that the next time this organism needs to be built, it can just be cloned from the cache instead of being rebuilt from scratch. Now with the addition of sexes, each genetic code can have up to 6 appearances. If I would continue using this system as is, all sexes would look like the first 3D model the game decides to build, so this whole system needs a rework. In the new situation, all caching mechanisms need to identify a model not only by genetic definition, but also by sex. So in turn, every time an existing model is taken out or a new model is put in, the code needs to somehow be able to provide this sex, and this happens at hundreds of places. So with that plumbing out of the way, what are some more fun things that we could do with this system? Well, the game already has separate forms for young and old animals. Why not use this same system to store a separate juvenile form? As you can see, I've designed the icons to really make clear what kind of things I hope the players will do with this. It's a system that in real life is mostly used by insects with their larval stage, where the larva fills a completely different niche, allowing one animal to fill 2 niches during its lifetime. So maybe a flying nectar-eating adult but a crawling leaf-eating larva. Or a land-dwelling adult but an aquatic larva. You may remember from the previous season that you can actually see the young hanging from the adult if you give it hands, which can give quite funny results now. The default young animal will actually look exactly like its parent but smaller. Except for the eyes. This is one of the many tricks I've picked up from analyzing every little detail in Spore. If you make the eyes bigger, it will look cuter. Works every time.
So, in short, along with sexual reproduction, I'm adding the option for animal species to have different forms. To my own surprise though, the longer I played with this system, the more cool mechanisms I could come up with.
Firstly, if you are on a map with seasons, you can have a separate form adapted for the cold with more body fat and fur, and then use the instinct, if you feel too cold, change sex, to activate it. And if the cold season has snow, you could even take advantage of the new camouflage system and make this winter version of your species white.
Second idea, you could have an alternation of generations kind of effect
where sex A always gives birth to sex B and vice versa, again to make sure that 2 individuals of the same species fill different niches. On Earth we see this strategy mostly in plants, but on your planet it's of course up to you. Okay, no, this is cool, let's do one more. You could create non-reproducing sexes with distinct roles, like workers and soldiers, like you see in bees, wasps and ants. Body size is also influenced by sex, so you could have a relatively rare but very large reproducing animal and then lots of smaller helpers. But my favorite idea, and I will really stop after this one, is inspired by some grasshopper species which have two separate forms. One normal solitary form and one swarming form, which looks and behaves differently. Apparently, when these grasshoppers, called locusts, encounter other locusts, it releases some sort of hormone, and if this happens enough times per minute during a 4-hour period, they transform into this swarm form. Locusts in swarm form are really attracted to each other and mate much quicker, forming, as the name suggests, swarms.
So we could, for example, have a hormone that counts the number of encounters with animals of the same species. And above a certain threshold, have the animal change to another niche, or from an asexual to a sexual form. I guess I could go on for hours, which is effectively the answer to the question we started with. Why did it take so long for sexual reproduction to be added? Well, this is a topic that I really needed to nerd out on. And I have to admit, I kinda lost sight on whether actual players will also like this. So I guess all I can do now is wait and see whether sex sells is also true for a video game about evolution.
Today's first bonus body parts are shark fins, which I originally really did not want to add. This is because there already is a really similar body part evolving from land fins inspired by dolphins. Shark fins and dolphin fins are really similar, which is convergent evolution, a beautiful phenomenon, but gameplay wise it's a bit weird to have two near identical parts. What made me change my mind is the fact that the shark fins are in a really different place in the family tree and in a place that could use some more scary material. I did my best to make them look as different as possible, but if you look at them side by side, the difference is smaller than I'd hoped for. The second one is this one, and it is mainly here to fix a stupid mistake I made. As you know, in the previous update I've added both arthropod mouths and filter feeding, so back then I was looking for something arthropod-like that could filter feed. And then I learned about the extinct family of the radiodons, so I looked no further and added this mouth. Several paleontologists, however, were friendly enough to point out that this particular mouth, inspired by Petoia, was actually not a filter feeder, but a predator. So let's try again. I think this one really is a filter feeder. Okay, bye.
Говоря же об этом видео, у меня есть некоторое по-своему забавное и в то же время, не знаю, восхитительное ли? Да, скажем, что восхитительная вещь, связанная с этим видео. Поначалу я ожидал трансляции, точнее говоря, не трансляции, а премьеры. И в чат написал, что было бы круто увидеть не 2 пола, а 3. И тут, спустя некоторое время по просмотру этого видео, разработчик сообщает, что вы можете сделать аж до 6 полов. Я тогда был приятно поражен, хотя бы потому, что мало того, что я угадал кое-какую особенность новой игровой фишки, так еще она оказалась даже круче ожидаемого. Что весьма похвально. Итак, следующее видео. Как соблазнить партнера в симуляторе эволюции. Демонстрация ухаживания. Смотрим. Так, выбралось 1080. Смотрим.
If I show you these three animals and I ask you to imagine you are an animal in an evolution simulation that wants to mate, which one would you choose? Or to rephrase the question, which one do you think is chosen more often? The answer is of course none, because there is no choice mechanism implemented. Let's figure out how we could make that work so that we can have something like this. For those of you new here, this is evolution simulation game The Sapling, my solo indie game project. It has two game modes. There are scenarios tasking you to design an ecosystem that meets specific requirements, but there's also a sandbox where you can build your own algae, plants and animals, turn on random mutations and see how they evolve. In nature, bright colors are typical for males. The idea here is that females are not available for mating as often because they might be pregnant or already caring for a young animal, so when they are available they have more choice. Males have more competition as a result of this, so they evolve brighter colors to stand out. Only in species that have much more females than males you typically see females with bright colors. I say bright colors, but what I really mean is at least two colors and a very high contrast between them. But in the sapling so far, animals could have only one color and any skin patterns were just the same but slightly darker. Really introducing a second color was a challenge, because for the animals I was using Unity's default shader, which allowed me to procedurally change the color of an object as a whole, but not the colors of individual patterns on top of that. But, long-time watchers know, I have a custom grass shader under my belt. So I now had the confidence to try writing my own animal skin shader. And I had the bulk of what I wanted done within an hour. And I had planned a whole week for it. It works like this. For each animal that the user creates, a procedural texture is generated that matches the body plan of the animal. In the old situation, this texture was treated as the grayscale version to be given its final color on the fly. In the new situation, the textures look like this. The red channel in the texture stores the skin pattern, like spots or stripes, and the green channel stores the skin type, like feathers. This makes it possible to recolor skin type and skin pattern individually in the shader. For example, this pixel in the procedural texture has a high value in its red channel, meaning it should be whatever secondary color the player has chosen to form stripes. But this pixel has a high value in its green channel, meaning that it should be darker to form feathers. And because I wrote this shader myself, I have way more control over how the animals look, and I can, for example, calculate how far a pixel is from the beginning or end of the animal. So I can have skin patterns like this one, where the strength of the second color is determined based on the distance to the end, or this one, where it is calculated based on the distance to the center. As an aside, I can of course also take the other axis and calculate for each pixel the distance to the spine of the animal. This is a material for debugging, where it starts black and gets lighter the further away it gets from the spine, but it looks a lot like counter shading, which is the phenomenon that animals are lighter at their belly. It's an effect I've wanted ever since seeing this art by Red Slug. This is how it looks in the editor, which might seem quite subtle, until I turn it off and you see how much shade is actually being countered. Anyway, to be considered attractive, animals should have two colors that are far from each other on the color spectrum or far from each other on the brightness spectrum. There is now a new attractiveness statistic that indicates how well you are doing. But as the initial question already gave away more or less, attractiveness is determined not only by colors but also by body parts. A number of existing body parts will get an attractiveness statistic, like all horns and antlers, but I'm also adding lots and lots of new body parts with this purpose specifically, inspired by current animals, extinct animals, and speculative evolution projects. In fact, I had so many ideas for attractive body parts, in particular decorative feathers, that I decided to group them like I did with fins, which change shape based on whether you put them on the back, on the sides, or at the end. For fins, I did it because I didn't want to force the player to learn that tail fins should go at the end, side fins on the side, etc. But at the time I did not feel 100% happy with this decision, because I felt I was taking control away from the players who actually did want to put a tail fin on the side for some reason. But then I played relaxing castle building game Tiny Glade, which takes a radically different approach. For example, if your path touches a wall, it becomes a door. If you put lampposts near a wall, they become hanging lamps. If you put your window on the roof, it becomes a dormer.
and if you put two windows opposite each other, a washing line appears. My personal hero Will Wright, creator of The Sims, SimCity and Spore, has mentioned on several occasions that he thinks about his simulation games as toys, and Tiny Glade takes this idea to the extreme. Instead of allowing the player to build whatever ugly thing they had in mind, it takes control away from the player in exchange for a tool that is interesting to use.
To my surprise, this makes the game really fun to play. It feels like you're discovering Easter egg after Easter egg. So that's why I'm now fully embracing location-specific body part shapes. And quite a lot of the new stuff has 3 variations. One for the top, one for the side and one for the tail. Annoyingly, I almost always could only come up with only 2 similar looking birds, so I had to make up a third one.
For example, cockatoo, rooster, fantasy animal, spatula tail, peacock, and fantasy animal, hummingbird, astrapia, and fantasy animal. I also even retrofitted existing body parts. For example, if you put these horns on the back, it becomes a clubtail, and for these horns you will get a thagomizer. There will also be a few body parts where the attractive value will not be immediately clear until they start making noise, like the rattle we saw before, and this abdomen with vibrating timbals, inspired by cicadas. This, by the way, also marks the first time animals will be able to make noise without their mouth. Sound will therefore also be visualized differently as a growing but fading sphere, inspired by games like Sky. Another group of attractive body parts will be surprisingly lightweight and aerodynamic compared to the others, but that's only because they can be moved out of the way some way or the other. They will need a display instinct though, for example when they see a potential mate, before the extra attractiveness is unlocked. And of course this body part type will also be resizable, which is why scary and sexy fit so well within one update. The larger you make an attractive body part, the more attractive it will be, but it will also be heavier and less aerodynamic. Perhaps the biggest challenge when it comes to resizing body parts is how to communicate to the player how exactly resizing affects the statistics. As a first step, I'm adding more unity in the UI. And there were that many statistics in the game, I had a separate icon for each statistic, but I've been gradually moving away from that approach, because 20 different icons in such a small space was a bit overwhelming. Inspired by Mario Kart of all places, I've slowly but steadily replaced a lot of statistics with simple dots. I'm paying with personality because this looks a lot more boring, but I get readability in return. You can now see at a glance what are the advantages and disadvantages of a body part and how it compares to others. Important for this system is that more dots always means better, so some statistics had to be inverted, which explains the weird lightweight statistic instead of just weight, but overall I feel it's an improvement. But now these same 5 dots also need to communicate what will happen if we resize the body part. To make it a bit more concrete, a dot can now mean not 1 but 3 things. Most dots are always there, whether you resize it or not. Some dots will appear when you increase the size, like a body part being more attractive or a leaf catching more sunlight if you make it bigger, and some dots will disappear when you increase the size, like a body part becoming less lightweight. So how do I visually keep apart these 3 options? I've really tried everything, like different colors for the dots, different shapes for the dots, but I felt all of it was just making the whole thing look messy and not intuitive. In the end, I settled on a system where you can see the slots where the dots go. Fixed dots are brown, dots that will go away if you increase the size are white, and for dots that will appear if you increase the size, it shows an empty slot. The big advantage of this design, as compared to my other attempts, is that new players can completely ignore it. You can still always count the dots and have a good idea of what a body part is good at. To teach the more experienced players how this UI should be interpreted, I added a mouse over effect for body parts, where you can see the dots change as you change the size. So, who would be chosen? Of course, now the answer is no, it still doesn't work yet, because these things cannot walk. To prevent players just putting every beneficial body part on their animal, the game has had a weight system already since the Fight and Flight update.
One of the many things I've learned from reading every review of the game everywhere ever is that this weight system might be too strict. Apparently it's quite a negative experience for the more creative player if they spend 30 minutes creating their dream animal only to discover that it cannot walk.
So from now on, adding more legs will allow the animal to carry more weight in exchange for speed. This also nicely solves another case where the visual appearance of an animal didn't affect the simulation, because so far you could add or remove legs as often as you'd like. Now it determines how many other body parts the animal can carry. However, if you have an animal that has the strength to carry a lot of weight, that still doesn't mean it has the space. In the animal builder you still have only 2 slots per torso part, so if I'd want to create an animal with 4 eyes, ears and horns, it would look something like this. I need to completely redo something here. My answer? Subslots, which appear once you put a body part somewhere. It's quite simple from the player's perspective, or at least I hope so, but under the hood this makes the situation a lot more complex, because besides direction, the game now also needs to store which subslot a body part occupies. This required a lot of rewiring all over the game, like the animation system, the save load system, the system that calculates an animal's statistics, the random mutation system, you name it.
Okay, so I've implemented attractiveness in various ways. I've added resizing of body parts, I've adapted the weight system, I allow much more body parts. Can we now finally answer our question? Turns out no, because it rarely happens that a female animal becomes pregnant and there are multiple fertile animals around and of the correct sex. Because obviously the whole attractiveness system doesn't work if the female doesn't choose between at least 2 mates. It took a long time of studying the simulation and running experiments, but I finally arrived at a solution. The main insight came when I realized that most females do reproduce multiple times within their lifetime.
Combine this with the fact that many real animals can store sperm for longer amounts of time, and you've got a working system. Females will simply only mate again if the new mate is more attractive than the previous one. So, fertile animals of the sapling, be ready for this drop-dead gorgeous hottie. Next time I will go into the ultimate scary life form. Life that feasts on the dead. Today our first bonus body part is this spine sail, mostly inspired by the Dimetrodon, although apparently it also still exists in some chameleons. If you put it on the side you get frills, initially inspired by the Dilophosaurs in Jurassic Park. For completeness, real Dilophosaurs didn't have these frills, but here again, there is a living animal that does have them, the frilled lizard. The second one is the sunbeam caterpillar, which extends hair-like tentacles if you use its display action. In real life, this is mostly to scare off predators. In the game, you can also use this body part to increase attractiveness.
Да, показалось, что камера просела. Здесь же я не знаю, что могу рассказать любопытное. Просто хорошие механики, что могут дополнить половое размножение в симуляции. И больше ничего. И последнее на сегодня видео, перед началом премьеры. Что столь сложного в симуляции грибов? Смотрим.
Okay, I'm doing it. The fungi challenge. Remember when I said that I wasn't planning to simulate underwater life, but got convinced by the community, forcing me to add a whole unplanned extra editor for algae? Yeah, it happened again. But fungi are mostly invisible to humans, and you know how I always say no simulation without visualization. So how would a fungus editor work exactly? For a long time I thought it couldn't be done, but here we are. For those of you new here, this is evolution simulation game The Sapling, my solo indie game project. It has two game modes. There are scenarios tasking you to design an ecosystem that meets specific requirements, but there's also a sandbox where you can build your own algae, plants and animals, turn on random mutations and see how they evolve. In the first episode of this series, I already quickly mentioned nutrients, a new soil statistic. It's a summary statistic for things like nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, and it will be a simple requirement for plants. If it's there, the plant will live, otherwise it will die. What I didn't mention is that each plant will consume a little bit. Here you see how it looks in places where plants have been growing for a long time. So how can you refill it? That's where fungi come in. Every time something dies on land, it will add a bit of detritus to this location, and if a location has detritus, fungi can live there and will add nutrients back into the soil.
The decrease of nutrients will be slow though, so it's not something beginner players will have to worry about immediately.
But if you want to run the simulation for a little longer, fungi will be crucial for your ecosystem.
And besides creating the nutrients plants need, they are also a new food source for animals. Fun fact, when researching what kind of animals typically eat fungi, I discovered that these are the same mouths that now only specialize for seeds and nuts, which is probably not a coincidence. If an area does not have nutrients, plants and fungi can slowly conquer it. As a first step, plants from elsewhere arrive at the borders but immediately die. This adds detritus to this location, so fungi can live there, which in turn will add nutrients. This means plants can now settle permanently, and the cycle begins anew until the whole area is covered. The transition from detritus to nutrients will not work in areas with slow moving water, however, so just like in real life, swamps will be low in nutrients. And as we saw in the first episode, plants that cannot get their nutrients from the soil will need to catch it themselves, so that's why we will see carnivorous plants wherever fungi can do their job. To teach the new nutrient mechanic to the players, I'm adding a new scenario, the swamp. It was actually a super simple scenario to make because it doesn't have anything special, with one major exception. Unlike the other scenarios, it starts with very low nutrient levels. At first, some plants might be able to survive here, but the task of the player is to quickly create a simple ecosystem of animals that actively visit plants, so that when nutrients run out and the plants are forced to switch to carnivory, there is enough prey to catch.
With the whole detritus nutrient cycle in place, we have everything we need for our fungus editor to make sense. But we haven't actually solved the fungi challenge yet. How to visualize something that is mostly invisible.
The first sparks, the rough beginnings for an idea, came to me while working on plankton. As you might know, plankton in this game is actually only phytoplankton, because that fit the simulation way better.
Why not do something similar for fungi too, and focus mostly on the visible part? Why not make the fungus editor a mushroom editor?
The first thing you might notice about this editor is that it is really simple. Perhaps it will stay that way, or perhaps fungi turn out to be a crowd favorite, and I'll add a million details like in the plant and animal editors. We'll see. The mushroom can be larger, which means the spores will go further, but the wind resistance goes down. And the cap can be larger, which means there are more spores and thus more offspring, but the temperature resistance goes down. On the right, besides the usual color bars and body size buttons, you can also choose what kind of cap you want, which among other things determines how spores will spread. For this cap, that's via the wind, which is convenient but won't be very effective on a planet with no wind. For this puffball, it's animal touch. And we've also got a splash cup, which spreads spores with the help of raindrops. Under the hood, the resizing of these caps does not work the same way for all of them. Some caps scale the same in all directions, like this one, but for others, like this one, that turned out to look weird. So this one only scales on the X and Z axis. I've made it so this is something that can be configured per cap.
As for the editor music, I googled around a bit for inspiration, but I only found music created for or by people who actually wanted to eat mushrooms, which is a really different kind of music, so that wasn't helpful. In the end, I decided it needed to sound like earth, like the soil below your feet, so I needed a really low organic sound. To achieve this, I used a bass clarinet, which I use everywhere in the game. But also a flotando playing style for the double bass.
Flotando is a special style of playing with the bow closer to your face and minimal pressure on the strings. It gives a very breathy sound, almost like a flute, hence flotando. On top of that, I've added everyone's favorite reverb, Valhalla Shimmer, which I use in all of the editors. Another thing I wanted is to make it feel like this organism isn't one thing, it's everywhere, and for this I use lots of little mandolin notes. This style of ambient music is called a swarm, and I've linked it to my MIDI controller here so I can control both the frequency and intensity of the notes, like this. And of course I couldn't help myself and also hide the game's main theme in there. For those of you that missed it, by popular request the soundtrack is also available separately on Steam, and yes, I will make sure to add all editor music as well. Now that I can actually see and feel the fungus editor, I'm starting to feel like with the fungi challenge, I was actually trying to answer the wrong question. I am not creating a scientific tool that should be 100% true to life, I am making a game for humans to enjoy. And mushrooms is what humans see. I'm not simulating every possible animal either, just the ones that are really visible to humans. So the question shouldn't be how to visualize the invisible, but what is the visible part of fungi? Is there something we can change about this visible part, and would that change have an impact on the simulation somehow?
And the answer to that is hell yeah.
Today's first bonus body part is a slingshot-like horn inspired by the extinct brontosaurs, nicknamed the Thunder Beast. The second one is this vestigial wing. I've added these flightless penguin-inspired aquatic wings in the Sea and Sandbox update already, but to my surprise I continue to get requests for flightless wings. Now we have courtship display, these wings, with the sole purpose of showing off, also make sense. I expect them to evolve in situations where at least one sex has a lot of competition in places where the advantages of flight are not that strong.
И здесь мне есть что пообсуждать. В особенности тот забавный факт, что пока разработчик искал вдохновение для музыки, связанной с грибами, он находил только ту музыку, что была создана для людей или едящих грибы, или что была написана для людей грибы, собирающихся есть. Вдобавок, сам разработчик говорил, что его симуляция нуждается в симуляции, как процессе, с визуализацией. И никак иначе. И потому он поначалу считал, что грибы довольно сложно симулировать. До тех пор, пока он не рассказал, точнее говоря, не придумал, как эти проблемки решить, связанные с визуализацией симулируемого, и не рассказал о них в своем журнальчике. Я же могу сказать, что, в частности, не знаю, на этой ли картинке, да, на этой,
And I'll
у него довольно хорошо получилось визуализировать грибницу. Да, она, конечно, не будет видна по той причине, что она будет располагаться под землей, но стоит ее только вытащить на поверхность, хотя бы не намного, вытянуть некоторые ниточки и сделать спороносящие колоски любых форм, что разработчик пожелает. И мне кажется, что таким образом можно будет симулировать и плесень. И тогда уже получится редактор не просто шляпочных грибов, а грибов вообще. Не знаю, почему он сразу об этом не подумал. Но, во всяком случае, можно будет рассказать, поделиться этим в отзывах к игре. И узнать, что разработчик сам подумает на сей счет. Чуть не забыл вещь, о которой хотел рассказать. Весьма любопытное явление. Вроде прошло несколько недель с тех пор, как я смотрел эти журнальчики разработки. А меня уже трогает музыка. Столь она задушевная. Ай. Здорово, одним словом. И в то же время могу сказать, что Уэсселом Ступом, или Стоупом, так зовут этого человека, разрабатывающего сию игру, я в определенной мере, можно сказать, что горжусь. Ведь он умудряется в столь разнообразных областях человеческого знания разбираться, от рисования и программирования до 3D-моделирования и геймдизайна разбираться. Разбираться умудряется. И оттого его работой восхищаюсь. Что же, теперь перерывчик на 10 минут. И мы дожидаемся начала премьеры последней серии журнала разработки. Итак, что уже успели понаписать зрители? Ясно, не очень умные вещи. Так. Кадры по-прежнему проседают. И это не есть хорошо. Ну ладно. Тогда через 10 минут возвращаемся и приступаем к просмотру. Итак, я снова у микрофона. И у нас остается 60 секунд до премьера. Здорово. Так, остается совсем немного, потому выключаю камеру и смотрим.
If we look at the stuff I have introduced so far, it's all been pretty high on everybody's wishlist. But I also want to be a bit more ambitious than that. So I have an idea. Hear me out.
The more stuff I add, the more I worry that the percentage of the total player base that will actually see it gets smaller and smaller. Of course it's good to keep that core of true fans in mind, but if I can get new players to also enjoy the more recent editions, I catch two birds. But if I can get new players to also enjoy the more recent editions, I catch two birds with one stone.
The most effective way to introduce some simulation mechanic to new players is highlighting it with scenarios. So let's do that. This will be a scenario where you have to create a blood-drinking animal, and this is another where you have to create a species with more than 2 sexes. And this one where you have to create an animal that can fly, or this one where you have to create a plant that sheds its leaves during the cold season. And it doesn't stop there, there will be much more. What if I tell you these are 4 separate scenarios, but at the same time they are all the same thing? For those of you new here, this is Evolution simulation game The Sapling, my solo indie game project. It has 2 game modes. There are scenarios tasking you to design an ecosystem that meets specific requirements, but there's also a sandbox where you can build your own algae, plants and animals, turn on random mutations and see how they evolve. And more scenarios are just one of 3 things I want.
The second is permadeath, where you are given a certain task on a certain planet, but like in real life, you get only one chance. If you die, you will never see this world again.
We know permadeath from genres like roguelikes and platformers, but I think it could be a perfect match and huge missed opportunity for simulation games. Because it raises the stakes, it adds so much more emotion, so let's pioneer that idea a bit in this update. Finally, something that is often noted is that the sandbox where you get access to all body parts at once is too overwhelming. Part of the fun in a game that has a lot of content is unlocking all of that content one by one. So what do you get when you combine an endless supply of scenarios with permadeath and unlocking body parts? A new 3rd game mode, the Daily Challenge. So for those of you wondering, that's why I suddenly added a separate screen with just 2 buttons. I was planning for a 3rd one. Obviously, a daily challenge really depends on a good generator. Or 3 generators to be precise. Let me quickly go over them. Firstly, the terrain generator. This one I already added to the planet editor quickly after the CN Sandbox update because so many players suggested a randomize all button. All I had to do now was to cut it loose from the planet editor and make it available to other components in the codebase. Unlike the name suggests, the generated planet is actually not random at all, because the more extreme things you have on a planet, the harder it is to create a life form that will survive. So instead, the generator picks one thing that can be more extreme, like the wind strength or the softness of the soil, and keeps the rest within more moderate ranges. The second generator is not about place, but about time. It adds a colder season, for example, or a meteorite, or rising sea levels. It only fires about half of the time, but gives each scenario a special touch. The 3rd generator takes all of this into account and chooses a challenge from a pool of templates. Not all templates make sense for all planets, however. For example, if the number of places where a plant can grow is really small, the challenge generator should not suggest a plant-related challenge. To determine which templates won't work, I am again reusing some code from the planet editor, the code that calculates a planet's habitability. All templates that do not apply according to the habitability statistics are taken out of the pool before the final choice is made. The 3 generators use a seed which I set to be the current date, meaning everyone gets the exact same daily challenge. I'm kinda hoping this game mode will be some sort of community activity, where everyone can try the challenge, perhaps even try to speedrun it, and then discuss the results afterwards.
For this to work best, it's of course important that everybody gets access to the new challenge at the exact same time. Preferably a time where as much people as possible are awake or almost awake.
I've selected this time to be 8 PM UTC, with an in-game counter showing how much time you still have until the next challenge unlocks. Speaking of speedrunning, little fun fact, when the very first version of this game launched on Steam, I invited a Spore speedrunner to play the game and they agreed. You can still watch that speedrun here on YouTube.
Of course, I try to play quite a few of these generated scenarios myself, and one thing I noticed is that I often wanted to reuse an animal that I created for a previous scenario. In other words, while fun at the beginning, after a while it gets quite annoying that the game forces you to start from scratch all the time.
For that reason, I've now also added the option to archive your creations and reload them again on another planet. This makes the daily challenge feel like a deck builder card game, and I found myself strategically designing a creature that I could quickly evolve into whatever the daily challenge requires today. The species are saved as a file on your computer, so you can also share them with other players. This by itself has all kinds of interesting consequences. For example, players can now organize Bibbit-style tournaments to see who generated the most versatile creature.
For me personally, I also plan to do a more interactive version of Evolution Simulated, where followers on social media get to provide the starter organisms and have a say in natural disasters and stuff. More about that later.
If all goes according to plan, a large part of the player base will spend a significant part of their playtime in this new daily challenge mode, so I thought it would be appropriate to award these players with some extra music. Longtime viewers might know that the music is created on the fly by randomly mixing musical fragments that all fit together, because the music always stays in the same key. These fragments are organized into 5 layers. The background layer, which are solo strings, the epic layer, which are extra strings and bass faded in when the player zooms out, the color layer, which are French horns and clarinets, the rhythm layer, which fades in when the player speeds up time, and the foreground layer. The foreground layer has a number of generic fragments, but also a few that only trigger when the camera is close to specific weather types. The one you're hearing right now is the theme for rain, for example. For some more variation, I've changed the music engine so it can have separate color fragments depending on the game mode, and created new daily challenge fragments using this virtual Native American flute, which I really like. I then did the same for the foreground. The new foreground fragments use the celeste and the piano. Like all the new music, I'll also add this stuff to the soundtrack on Steam. So as for new features, that is all that I have for you at this time. I hope you've enjoyed this devlog season, and don't forget that the first public builds will appear on the beta branch on October 31. Players who've tried a beta branch before know that I am a man of my word when it comes to releasing stuff on beta branches. I will upload whatever I have at that point, no matter how buggy, so please be prepared.
Also a heads up, I will use October 31 as an opportunity to increase the price of the game a little bit, so if you already know you want to buy, you might want to do it before that date.
Wait, you didn't expect me to do a whole season of devlogs and barely mention performance, did you? Because we all know this is a major problem the game still has. If half of the players cannot use all of these new features, I might as well not have added them. Therefore, this update will not only contain a crazy game mode idea, but also an optimization project that, when I started, sounded ambitious. Let's take this scene. This is what the performance looks like, which you can think of as the before picture in a makeover TV show. I'm slightly oversimplifying, but you can think of the green part as the time your GPU takes to translate the 3D models into 2D frames to display on your monitor. You can make this time shorter by lowering the settings or with stronger hardware. As you can see though, on my high-end PC, this part is not the main problem. It's these blue spikes, caused by creating and keeping track of thousands of 3D models. The goal for now is to get rid of as many spikes as possible. My crazy optimization idea was that instead of hiding organisms in the distance, which is mostly what the game did so far, you can also go a step further and not even build them at all. This means that the game has to build them on the fly really quickly whenever the player actually does zoom in to look at a particular organism. So far, I've always thought that building so many objects on the fly would cause an unacceptable lag spike stutter. But when working on this update, I suddenly had the insight that in the current system I am already building and removing hundreds if not thousands of organisms in the background every frame. This process is highly optimized, which is why the game runs at all. So instead of doing lots of work in the background to be ready in case the player zooms in, let's only do a little bit of work when the player actually does zoom in. This way there is no need anymore to keep track of thousands of objects. Unfortunately, this idea meant redoing quite a lot of visualization code, so I started with the simplest organisms, algae, and immediately saw a huge increase in FPS and decrease in memory usage for underwater ecosystems. So I've now moved plants to this new approach as well. Unlike algae, which can be completely invisible because of the water, there has to be a billboard here that is roughly the same size as the plant it represents. This means we're still managing thousands of billboards, so the question now is, to what extent is that an improvement over thousands of detailed plant models? Because the success of this feature is so crucial to the future success of the game, I actually filmed myself working on it. Now the game only has to worry about plant models close to the camera instead of the whole map. Most of thousands of billboards, so the question now is, to what extent is that an improvement over thousands of detailed plant models? Because the success of this feature is so crucial to the future success of the game, I actually filmed myself working on it. Now the game only has to worry about plant models close to the camera instead of the whole map. Most of the blue spikes have been eliminated, making it possible to watch a large map full of plants with random mutations turned on and high time speed at acceptable frame rates. Please don't think that this will magically solve all the performance problems that this game has. It's still possible, also on my high-end PC, to get an FPS in the single digits, or to run out of memory. This update is, however, the largest step forward for performance in years. This means that way more people will be able to enjoy larger planets. Teeming with simulated life with acceptable frame rates. It's at moments like these that I'm reminded of that long train ride home, writing the very first code for this project, and wondering how close I'd get to simulating tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of organisms, all living and evolving on the same planet in real time. That dream is now closer to reality than ever. Thank you so much for sharing it with me. Okay then, for the final bonus parts, I have one which is inspired by the crazy pterosaur crests, increasing an animal's attractiveness. Initially I was wondering what to do with the sides, until I saw what the model for the top looked like on the sides. Yeah, I'm totally keeping this. And my favorite new body part for last, a sail with bioluminescent parts. To give the player some extra creative freedom, I've made it so the lights take on the secondary color of the animal.
И на этом все. Надеюсь, что вам трансляция понравилась. Вы познакомились с этим проектом получше. И на том все. До скорой встречи и пока.